Good afternoon, and welcome to the Institute for Strategic Policy Solutions. My name is Kimberly Jackson, and I'm the Executive Director. The Institute for Strategic Policy Solutions is located at St. Petersburg College at our Seminole campus. We're so honored to have you today for our suffrage program, which celebrates the 100th anniversary of the women's right to vote. We have a collaborative program with Stetson University, thank you, the University of Florida, and Florida A&M. This is a three-part series, and today is the first part. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the mission of the Institute before we begin our program. The Institute of Strategic Policy Solutions, or as we like to call it now, ISPS, was the brainchild of Congressman Bill Young. What he wanted to do was have nonpartisan civic discussions on social, political, and economic issues. This think tank memorializes his many strides in that achievement. Over the past year, we've tried to reconnect with many of our congressmen and dedicate ourselves to the programs in the community that mean so much, from working with veterans to working with partners in the community who deliver nonprofit essential services, to really just discussing issues like criminal justice reform that matter so much to our community. We invite you to visit our Facebook page, which has updated information on the Institute. At this time, I'd like you to see a video from our esteemed leader, Dr. Tondra Williams, who has a brief note about the purpose and the importance of the Institute.
You know, civic engagement is so important, not only to St. Petersburg College, but to the benefit of our entire community. What we hope to do at St. Petersburg College, especially in the Institute for Strategic Policy Solutions, our goal is to be the catalyst for change. We want to be the convener, the individuals who pull everybody together to talk about a common cause and a plan, to build the mission and the strategy, to move forward and make this county, this state, and our world a better place to live, learn, and play.
We'd like to say thank you, of course, to Dr. Williams and Mark Strickland, who's the provost of the Seminole campus, as well as the many other leaders and contributors to ISPS. And of course, our team that works so hard behind the scenes to make these programs meaningful to you. I'd like to now introduce Dr. Peggy Macdonald, who was nice enough to come along this journey several months ago with me, as I decided that we had to do more than just celebrate it as a blurb for one day of the achievements of women in voting. And she brought along other scholars for the ride for the second two series, so I want to thank you. I'm now going to introduce her. Dr. Peggy Macdonald is a public historian and adjunct professor at Stetson University and Indian River State College. She's a native Floridian and gives presentations on Florida women history with the Florida Humanities Florida Talks program. Her publications include a biography of environmental activist Marjorie Harris Carr and a forthcoming book on Florida's female pioneers. Dr. Macdonald has written about local and Florida history and culture for Gainesville Magazine, Our Town Magazine, Senior Times, and Forum Magazine. She is an alumna of the University of Florida, where she received a PhD in American history. And Dr. Macdonald served formerly as executive director of the Matheson History Museum from 2015 to 2019. I'm so honored to have you today. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure to plan this series on suffrage, and I can't wait to see the next two installments. For today, I want to thank everybody who has joined us, and we're going to get started by having an overview of the suffrage movement at the national level before we dip into Florida. We need to begin with an understanding of what suffragists were pushing for. What was it that they wanted at the national level? And to understand that, we need to think about what was going on in the American legal system. So the American legal system, of course, is based on English common law and the legal precedent inherited from England and also coverture. Under coverture, essentially upon marriage, the man and the woman become one, and the husband is the one. So a woman upon marrying would lose her rights to own property. She would also lose her identity, her legal identity in particular. And her husband would have the rights to not only her property, but to herself. The wife and their children would be the property of the husband. So when we fast forward to the Declaration of Sentiments in a moment, this is what they're calling for, changes to coverture, among other things. It's also important to think for a moment about Abigail Adams. So suffrage didn't come out of a vacuum, right? There were foremothers to the movement. And one of them in America was Abigail Adams, who was married to John Adams, our second president, and mother of John Quincy Adams, our sixth president. And with today being Constitution Day, it's interesting to look at the origins. So at the beginning of the Revolution, and throughout the Revolution, Abigail Adams wrote her husband, John Adams, many letters. He replied to some, and she complained in her letters that it was never enough in terms of quantity or quality. In one famous letter in March 1776, Abigail Adams wrote her husband that she was, I'm going to go ahead and quote Abigail Adams, "I long to hear that you have declared an independency, and by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by laws in which we have no voice or representation." Really, this is the beginning of the women's fight for suffrage, because the idea of taxation with representation will reemerge later in the 19th and 20th centuries with the suffragists. Abigail Adams was pleading with her husband, who was active in drafting what would become the precursor to the Constitution, right? The Articles of Confederation, which carried the nation through the Revolution and was later replaced with the Constitution, signed on September 17th, 1787, 233 years ago. Another foremother to consider is from Europe. So Mary Wollstonecraft is in particular remembered for her war of words with Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau is a philosopher and writer who's credited with influencing many with the Enlightenment movement, and his thought contributed to the Enlightenment movement. But he wasn't very enlightened when it comes to gender. In fact, he referred to women as the sex. Women were viewed as irrational, while men were rational. They were viewed as weak and dependent, while men were strong and independent. And Mary Wollstonecraft disagreed. And so she's famous for countering Rousseau. And she also wrote a book, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, in 1792, following on a previous publication on the rights of men. So this English writer and philosopher was a major inspiration for American suffragists. In fact, Susan B. Anthony had a framed picture of her hanging on her wall. And in her own publication, Susan B. Anthony serialized Wollstonecraft's work. So this, in many ways, provided a theoretical framework for the suffragists. One famous quote, there are many from Wollstonecraft, but one is, "The divine right of husbands, like the divine right of kings, may, it is hoped, in this enlightened age, be contested without danger." And she's writing in the 18th century, including after the American Revolution, when the French Revolution pushed further to tease around with the idea of including women, right? Women were demanding to be included. Now, many people have argued that the women's suffrage movement began with the abolition movement. However, as you see, there are other precursors leading up to that. But the Seneca Falls Convention is often thought of as being the real catalyst Well, before Seneca Falls, two of the organizers, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, along with other American and European women, traveled to London for the first World Anti-Slavery Conference. And the abolitionists who were there, who were primarily white men, were adamant that women would not be seated as delegates. So the American women attempted to take their seat literally on the floor, and American abolitionists joined European abolitionists in preventing that from happening. This led to the Seneca Falls Convention because it was clear that in addition to fighting for an end to slavery, women wanted rights of their own. The Declaration of Sentiments is one document, one important document that came out of this convention. So it, in many ways, mirrors the language of the Declaration of Independence, except that it refers to the rights of women. And one of the most famous things to come out of this declaration, of course, is the push for suffrage, for the franchise for women. But also, this was pushing back against coverture, and women were demanding rights to property, rights to have some say in what happened to their children, whether it be in their education or in the case of divorce. Now, this is a famous work picturing, it's a painting picturing the World Anti-Slavery Convention, and you can see the main focus is white men. But if you look carefully here on the margins, you can see some of the women in attendance, including in these impressive hats. So again, this World Anti-Slavery Conference in London was another precursor to Seneca Falls. Now, another thing to note is that even though white women who were working for the abolition of slavery also felt inspired to work for women's rights, that this progressive cause of women's rights was not always led by people who embraced rights for all women. Now, that could be said for men and white women, that there were barriers to Black women who wanted to be included in this movement. Sojourner Truth is an example of this early split in terms of women's rights. So she was almost as tall, actually she was exactly as tall as Frederick Douglass. They were both 6 feet tall. And Sojourner Truth, in her New York Times obituary, so she had an obituary printed at the time of her death. It was published in the New York Times. It referred to her commanding presence and her deep voice. In this picture, we can see her commanding presentation. Here she is. So she had reminded people in the 19th century, first of all, that Black women were also enslaved. Slavery was thought of as a male institution, but Black women and also children were also enslaved. She also worked to make it known that Black women needed to be included in the suffrage movement. So her Ain't I a Woman speech is really addressing this, that there were already different views of what women's suffrage would be. There were some who argued that women deserved special protections, and there were others that argued that women were equal to men. And this rift really continued for centuries and is not gone yet. But Sojourner Truth was referring to all the hard labor she did as an enslaved woman and child, and in making the case that ain't I a woman, and that she deserved to be treated equally through the suffrage movement. I want to move to the next screen. It's also important to note that in Wyoming, 50 full years before the 19th Amendment was passed by Congress on June 4th, 1919, in the territory of Wyoming, women won the suffrage. So 1869, they won the right to vote, and they exercised it in 1870 in their first election. And this is an important moment in history. And again, in Wyoming, there are examples of the vote being used to preserve white middle-class values. So when you have more people moving out west, the idea was that if you give women the right to vote, with the idea of white women in mind, it would make more of a majority of this white sort of middle-class view. So there's this underbelly of racism in the suffrage movement. Now I want to shift into women's contributions to the suffrage movement in Florida. So in this map of Florida, this is making it clear that Florida was a Spanish territory. So often people think of American history in terms of Virginia and Massachusetts, but as historian Michael Gannon wrote, by the time Jamestown was established, St. Augustine was well into urban renewal. So in this picture, you can see Spanish Florida. So I want you to think about why it would have been that in Florida, the suffrage movement wouldn't have taken off quite as quickly as it did elsewhere in the United States. It's important to think, first of all, about Florida as a Spanish colony, and also as a place where some of the first Floridians existed before European contact. So Florida did not become a state until 1845, and for decades before then, there was conflict where white settlers and also the federal government sent white raiders in, sent troops into Florida to instigate conflicts with the Seminoles. And this led to what white people refer to as the Seminole Wars, 3 different wars over the Florida territory and later the state of Florida. But the Seminoles referred to it simply as the Seminole War. To them, it was an ongoing war to first force them into reservations and later to remove them to Oklahoma. So Florida has a complicated history. And in terms of the suffrage movement, we could already look at examples of Abigail Adams writing in the 18th century for equality and including women in the what became the Articles of Confederation, while in Spanish Florida, there actually weren't as many women. Spanish Florida was viewed as an outpost, a military outpost, and it wasn't colonized with women and with families the way that early English colonies were. So it's just a different situation. And with this continuing theme of battling sexism and racism, Florida, on the eve of the Civil War, was half free and half enslaved. It was approximately half white and half black, not looking at the Seminole population. So there's, cotton thrived in Florida before and after statehood. And Florida was, of course, one of the states, the third state to secede from the Union. So in terms of the this movement for suffrage that came later in the 19th century, there were Black women who had to battle both racism and sexism. And you'll see, you'll hear more about this in the next 2 upcoming presentations. But I want to point out, for instance, that even at the national level, right, this is not purely a Southern problem. Even at the national level with the National American Women's Suffrage Association, whose presidents included Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, although Black women were welcome as members at the national level at the 1913 suffrage parade in Washington, D.C., Black women were told to march at the back of the parade instead of being with their states who they represented. So some women, including Ida B. Wells, didn't appreciate this and took action to march with their own states. At the state level in Jacksonville, Jacksonville was a hotbed of suffrage activity. This is at the Bethel Church in Jacksonville, and you can see in the front row in the center, Eartha White. And this is at 1915 suffrage meeting of the Colored Women's Club. So at the state and local levels, and this is not just in Florida, this is across the nation, Black women were excluded from participation in most women's clubs and suffrage activities. So they formed their own organizations. And you can see in this picture, suffragists, African-American suffragists in Jacksonville. Here we could see a bust of Ella Chamberlain, and it's at the Tampa Riverwalk. So Tampa played a big role in the suffrage movement as well. And at the time, there was not yet a Pinellas County, right? So in 1892, generally, Ella Chamberlain is credited with jumpstarting the Florida suffrage movement. She relocated here, was experienced in suffrage, and she married, and her husband had orange groves. Of course, this is a time when many people moved to Florida with the dream of living the easy life, growing oranges, and pursuing their dreams. Well, one of her interests was writing for the newspaper, and she proposed a new column to the Tampa Bay paper, the Tampa Morning Tribune, and the editor thought that she would write about, cake recipes or children, and Chamberlain said, no, we have enough of that already, and she wrote instead about women's issues and suffrage. So she used the newspaper to launch, really start Florida's suffrage movement. But her view was laced with xenophobia and racism. Her argument in the paper was that why should she, as an American woman, be subject to the Negro and the alien were the terms she used to refer to non-white voting men. So she argued women should get the suffrage so that they could represent themselves and not be represented by Black men or immigrants. In 1894 to 1895, there was a series of devastating freezes that killed much of the citrus industry in North Florida and pushed the rest of the industry further and further south. So around the time of the Great Freezes, Ella Chamberlain left Florida around 1897, shortly after the freezes. You can see in this picture, what's covering the ground is oranges. The oranges are all off the trees. This was devastating for one of Florida's major crops. And Elizabeth Taylor wrote a history in the 1950s of the Florida suffrage movement. And she said after Chamberlain left, the suffrage movement stalled in Florida. Around 1912, things changed. And in this interesting car, if you look carefully, you could see there's a banner that says equal suffrage. This is in front of the 1892 Orange County Courthouse. This image is from the Orange County Regional History Center. And the History Center has a new exhibit on the Ocoee Massacre, which we'll talk about later. But in this float, you could see women in white dressed for the suffrage float in about 1913, which followed an event in 1912 when the Orlando mayor invited all freeholders to register to vote for an upcoming municipal election where they would choose the mayor. Well, a group of women showed up at the courthouse to register to vote, and none of the male clerks knew what to do with these women. And they would refer them to their colleagues. And finally, the city attorney came out and said that according to the Florida Constitution, women did not have the right to vote. It was very clear. And this galvanized this group of women to push for suffrage. Mary Safford was living in Orlando, and she was elected president of the Orlando Equal Suffrage League. And she was an experienced suffragist, and she had also been president of the Iowa Women's Suffrage League, Equal Suffrage League. You can see in this picture here, she was a minister, and she was very active both at the state level and in Iowa, and lobbied the Congress to pass the 19th Amendment. So just like Jacksonville and Tampa, Orlando had a strong suffrage movement. The largest organization to support suffrage was the Florida Federation of Women's Clubs. And in this image of Mayman Jennings, when she was the First Lady of Florida from 1901 to 1905, Mayman Jennings developed tremendous political clout through her connections to her father. She had gotten to know a lot of Florida politicians, And then her husband married her for her political connections, and she helped him, William Sherman Jennings, when he was governor. And then after her term as First Lady ended in 1905, Jennings continued to be active in a variety of clubs. She helped establish different clubs, and she became the president of the Florida Federation of Women's Clubs, right at the time that the Florida suffrage movement was really kicking off. And her role, one of the most important things she did for suffrage was that at a time when women who were active in Pinellas County and across the state in Audubon societies and establishing public libraries through the women's clubs and a variety of other civic duties, there was a great deal of concern, at least as expressed by the Florida Federation of Women's Clubs leaders, that if the organization embraced the cause of suffrage, it was too political and it would interfere with the women's other work. Well, Mayman Jennings convinced them otherwise when she was president of the organization, and in 1915, the Florida Federation of Women's Clubs adopted a new position, and they began to lobby the Florida legislature to start a state constitutional amendment to allow women to vote. Now, later, as president of the same organization, the Florida Federation of Women's Clubs, Gainesville resident Caroline McCullum Palmer, who was previously president of the Gainesville Women's Club, known as the 20th Century Club, led the organization in further lobbying. So she continued the work that Mayman Jennings had done before her. And at this point, the Florida Federation of Women's Clubs had about 10,000 members. They were the largest organization in the state to support women's suffrage. And the Federation had regularly, they sent lobbyists to the legislature, and they also used their women's clubs newsletters, and they would have a women's clubs page in all of their local newspapers to push for what was called the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. And unfortunately, although the lobbying efforts were professionally done and were constant, there was resistance. One thing that the Florida legislature did support was the concept of municipal suffrage, the idea that women could not have the right to vote in a national election or national primary, but they could vote at the local level, for instance, for mayor or for city commission. So by 1915 in Florida, there were already women voting. So Zena Dreyer in Fellsmere was the first woman in Florida and possibly in the South to vote in a municipal election. So Fellsmere lays claim to being the birthplace of Florida women's suffrage. In addition, there were other strategies. So municipal voting was one very successful strategy, and one thing it led to was electing women to office. Other strategies included pushing for the 19th Amendment, the federal amendment to the Constitution, to allow women to vote. And another strategy was to allow women to vote in the primary, right? So Florida at this point was a one-party state. If you weren't voting Democrat in the primary, you would have no say in who would be elected. So part of the idea of allowing women to vote in primaries would be that it would prevent Black women from voting. So again, we see this tension in the suffrage movement between white women and their white male supporters and Black women who were working separately, and also Black men supporting women's suffrage. Now, this is a picture of a woman who was a grandmother. She was 73 years old when she was first arrested for picketing the White House. She actually is the only Florida woman, according to Judith Poucher, who has written a history, an article published in Florida Historical Quarterly on Mary Nolan, the only Florida woman to have written a suffrage imprisonment narrative. So she referred to her first time where she was jailed for several days And there was this one night where 41 of the women who were not released from jail, who were all beaten, all tortured. And she called it the Night of Terror. Now, again, she was 73. She was a grandmother. She was handicapped. She had issues with her foot. And yet she was pushed and shoved against an iron bed in her cell. Again, I encourage you to read Judith Poucher's history if you'd like to find out more about her. But she was one of the most militant, if not the most militant suffragist in Florida, and also lived in Jacksonville, but was born in Virginia. And often women who worked for suffrage were also involved with the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And the United Daughters of the Confederacy, among other things, were active in erecting Confederate statues across Florida and across the South. Now, Nolan was born in Virginia in 1842, so she was one of the oldest suffragists, and she was an adult during the time of the Civil War, and later relocated to Florida, which had also seceded. So she was active in UDC activities while also being a suffragist. Getting back to the Tampa Equal Suffrage League. So under Ella Chamberlain, there was the Florida Women's Suffrage Association. After that Orlando moment where the Orlando Equal Suffrage League was established with Mary Safford as president, and then Mary Safford became, she was elected the president of the state, the Florida Equal Suffrage League. Gradually, most of the suffrage associations across the state adopted the equal suffrage name. And Tampa was actually the host to the very first suffrage convention in 1895 and continued to be active in the suffrage movement. Now, what happened with municipal voting when you have large blocks of women voting, and at this point, before the 19th Amendment, this was largely white women voting in municipal elections. There were white women who were elected to office. And here we have a picture of the fashionable Marion Horowitz. Now, Catherine Tippett from the St. Petersburg area would have been horrified at her hat. If you look carefully, you can see bird feathers and body parts. Tippett was among the Florida women who established Audubon societies and worked within the Audubon societies to stop this practice of killing largely Florida birds for fashion. Nonetheless, Horowitz was the first female mayor in Florida, elected in 1917. I could not find an image for Pearl Groves Maddox, but she's another woman who was elected. This was to the Archer City Council before the 19th Amendment was ratified. And researching these women is difficult because they didn't tend to go by their own names. Many of the suffragists went by their husband's names. So Pearl Maddox was Mrs. H. Maddox. So I had to research him, find out there was a first Mrs. Maddox, find out that there was a second one, and she was the one who was elected. And I found her name because she authored a book. And there was a review of her book in 1917 in the University of Florida student paper. So her name is returned and restored to her, Pearl Groves Maddox. Virginia Burnside was the first woman elected to the city council in St. Petersburg, Florida. Ray Arsenault, in his History of St. Petersburg, he refers to how she was reelected twice, but unfortunately, another woman was not elected to office again after her until 1951. Ray Arsenault, by the way, just announced he's retiring. He's a longtime Florida historian who has written extensively about St. Petersburg, where he founded the Florida Studies program at USF. Now, even though there was municipal voting, not until the 19th Amendment was ratified and went into effect in Florida. And so August 18th, 1920, it was ratified, and 8 days later, it went into effect. So August 27th, the next day, we have Faye Gibson Moulton Bridges being the first woman to cast her vote in an election after the ratification of the 19th Amendment. And this is what she looked like. I'd also like to point out, since we're talking about women in Florida being elected to office, Even though it was a little later, in 1967, Betty Mae Tiger Jumper was elected the first tribal chair of the Florida Seminoles, but also the first elected female tribal chair of any American Indian nation. So that happened here in Florida. Now, once the 19th Amendment went into effect in Florida and across the nation, now it's important to note that Florida did not ratify it. I found a Gainesville Daily Sun article from the 2 days after Congress passed the 19th Amendment, the Susan B. Anthony Amendment as it was known. And the article optimistically stated that Florida might be the first state to ratify the 19th Amendment. Actually, it didn't ratify it for another 50 years. In 1969, symbolically, Florida ratified the 19th Amendment. And this was also something that happened in other southern states. It's tied to that same recurring theme of not wanting Black women to vote. One Florida politician argued at the time that the 19th Amendment was being discussed in the Florida legislature, that 2 million Black women voters would be added to the register. And it was something that the white men who were then in power did not want to see. Now, a white woman in power in her own way, not in an elected office, but using her longtime clout in Florida to work through nonprofit organizations to work with club women, again, was Mayman Jennings. So in this image from the Florida Federation of Women's Clubs Florida Bulletin, we could see that she was actually nominated to be the president of the new General Federation of Women's Clubs, a new national organization for women's clubs. Although she did not, she wasn't elected president, she became the first vice president. She also founded the Florida Women League of Voters. So through the League of Voters, the goal was to take this new block of registered voters, voting women, and then enhance their power by educating them on the issues. Now, at the same time that Mayman Jennings and other Florida women were working for the 19th Amendment to be passed and then ratified, Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune in Daytona Beach had a different struggle. She was working to help not only Black women, but also Black men exercise their right to vote. So 50 years before the 19th Amendment was ratified, the 15th Amendment went into effect, allowing Black men to vote. However, after Reconstruction ended, most African Americans were unable to vote across the South. Mary McLeod Bethune opened up the school named for her to offer night classes in reading to help Black men and women pass literacy tests. She also went around on a bicycle, door to door, collecting money for a poll tax fund so that Black voters who were unable to pay the poll tax would be able to vote. So it's important to note that even though the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, there is an ongoing vote to allow equal suffrage for all Americans. And this will be one of the themes in the next two upcoming programs, where in particular in the next program, you'll have an expert on Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune speaking about her efforts. And before I close, I want to mention in 2020, we have the 100th anniversary as well of the Ocoee Massacre. So Paul Ortiz has written about this in his book, Emancipation Betrayed. The Ocoee Massacre took place when Black voters tried to exercise their constitutionally protected right to vote in 1920. So at the same time that we have new groups of voters allowed to vote, in theory, including white women and Black women and Latino women in Florida, we also have voter suppression stepping up. So because Black citizens were voting in Ocoee, there was a massacre. Also in 1923 in Rosewood, Florida, there was another massacre, right? So we see acts of racial violence. Lynching is still a threat to Black voters, even after the ratification of the 19th Amendment. And I'd also like to discuss how in 1951, the often overlooked first martyrs of the classic civil rights movement were right here in Florida, in Mims. On Christmas Day, a bomb was placed under their bed, and Harry T. Moore and his wife Harriet were killed. And Harry T. Moore led an effort that successfully registered over 116,000 African Americans to vote in Florida. And he and his wife were teachers, and he was very involved with NAACP. So because of their efforts, they were assassinated. Because of Dr. Bethune's efforts to help Black men and women pass the literacy test and pay the poll tax, her school, now known as Bethune-Cookman University, was threatened by the KKK. I don't want to go too much into depth on Dr. Bethune when you have the next speaker from the panel discussion, Dr. Ashley Robertson Preston, coming up in October, but a tiny preview of what's to come. And I'd like to close with this note about this ongoing struggle for justice. So in 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was passed, finally there were protections, federal protections, for African American men and women who exercise their constitutionally protected right to vote. Still, there have been additional attempts at voter suppression. They are ongoing in every state in the United States at every election season. And in terms of Florida, we have had a battle now for about 2 years to allow ex-felons to vote. And the latest decision is that they will not be allowed to vote unless they pay any fines that are due related to their court costs and imprisonment. And this goes against the wishes of the Florida voters. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over for our Q&A session.
You just said so much. I was trying to keep up and I could not write quick enough. I just think it's more than appropriate on Constitution Day to really celebrate the achievements of every American's right to exercise their right to vote. And we don't often think about women in their struggle and women who died. You think about the Night of Terror. I used to teach that. And you think about, like, we don't have the images that we have of the civil rights movement like we do of the women's rights movement, purposefully, because we don't, history did not want to document the atrocities that were done to many women. I want to encourage, first of all, anyone who has interest in having questions, please put your questions in the chat or in the Q&A, and I will try to address all questions we have. I'm just going to engage in a little bit of conversation regarding, first, what you said, the Declaration of Sentiments. I reread it today and I was just so amazed because you spend so much time talking about the Declaration of Independence, but they did such a great job of capturing what was done specifically to women as a result. So, I wanted to read this part, but when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of women under this government, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to demand the equal station to which they are entitled. The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. And you talked about in the beginning being property. I really want to emphasize that about women not being able to sign their own contracts, women not being able to accept positions or employment, women not being able to be professionals, women not being able to control what would happen to them if their spouse left them, and divorce, and the abuses when there are abuses on women and children. So coming from a time, it's just such bravery. What did you learn about the women's actual bravery rights during this time? Like who, I guess, exhibited the most brave posture during this time period for you?
I am very impressed at Mary Nolan, even though she was, we need to acknowledge that she was active with the UDC. She was born in Virginia. The fact that she was in her 70s and already had issues with a foot and still picketed the White House, traveled from Jacksonville to Washington, D.C., picketed the White House, and was arrested multiple times and jailed. One time she was arrested for burning one of Woodrow Wilson's speeches. It reminds me a little bit of Nancy Pelosi ripping up a speech. I won't get into it in any detail, but to burn the president's speech in front of the White House, in Washington, D.C., it really does. After being arrested, after suffering what she called that night of terror with other suffragists, and at her age, at the time, women were really ancient. They were considered ancient in their 70s. And there she was, this grandmother suffragist. But in general, I think a lot of people today don't understand, a lot of not just women who were students, but a lot of women my age, right? I'm Generation X, don't realize that women had no property rights at all throughout much of American history, including no rights to their own person, as you were talking about with the abuse. There was no concept of marital rape and no rights to their own children, how they would be educated, if they could stay with them, if their marriage ended. And many of the women who, and especially in England as well, women who were very active and very militant in the suffrage movement lost their children as a consequence.
It's overwhelming. We do have our first question, and it relates to felon rights, so I'm going to get to that in a moment. But I wanted to talk quickly about the contention, if you will, between the parallel movements of suffrage for African American men, and then the contention further, which of course we'll get in our next series, but briefly the contention between African American women and Caucasian women. One thing that resonated with me is the Colored Women's Club, because many African American, including myself, American women, are still a part of these women's groups. Many of the sororities, a part of the Divine Nine, many civic organizations, they still resonated from that time period where women weren't permitted to have the same access to these programs as rights of all for women versus men. And it really resonated with me when you talked about women having to deal both with racism and also with gender issues. So I wanted to speak a little bit more about that before I get to that question.
Now, you're a Spelman alumna, right?
I am.
and I'm a Hollins alumna. It's a women's college in Virginia. And I think we felt a sense as students at a women's college of the empowerment of being at an institution that supports women. But it's only a taste of what it would have been like in the 1800s and the early 1900s for women who had no access to formal education in many cases, who had no access to the professions, couldn't vote, and then became club women in these segregated clubs and had that support network where they could hear speakers and they could become active and even militant, and they could work in their communities to better their communities. So at the same time that you have this, Florida had the highest per capita lynching at the time that we're looking at. At the same time that is happening, yes. Then you also have, so-called colored women's clubs, and Bethune founded one because she had to, right? She was not welcome in the white women's clubs. But this was something that put Black women at the same level as white women. They're, in the sense that they're doing the same work in the community. They are having the same opportunities at speakers. And that's one thing the early suffragists talk about. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was talking about their primary sources available at the Library of Congress, where she's talking about preparing for the convention, and that there just aren't any good speakers, any good women speakers, because women were not trained. They were expected to be in the home. This is the theory, right? This is not the practice. in the theory, you have white women and they're at their homes and they're provided for, and their husbands are at work. In reality, you have at this time in the last half of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, white and Black and Latino women working. They're often working at factory jobs, right? Or they're working on the farm, or they're working in sharecropping, right? That's the reality of it. This is elevating to have access to clubs. I'm sorry, I've gone on and on.
No, it's interesting. I was in my mind, I was thinking about also the propaganda that went along in enforcing this idea of what would happen if you do give rights. But I want to move forward to, it's kind of hard when we have this conversation not to talk about modern day topics, even though for our guests today, we will be moving forward. Today is an overview. Our next session is on pre-1920. Our last session is post-1920. But to ask the question, I think it's you're going to have to give a little bit of history about it. The first question was, with the felons not being able to vote unless they pay fines, does that go against the 24th Amendment with the ban on the poll tax? And I just want to say that we have cases that have been testing since this is very new, and we as citizens in the last election voted to give rights to felons, and that was challenged based on the fact that there were fines associated, and it was challenging for some felons to quantify what those fines were, where the court just came down and said that the fines, them having to pay fines, is appropriate. So, what I say as a lawyer is that the law stands as it is right now. But if you want to shed any light about rights as it relates to felons, if you can intertwine that.
I like how you put that, about being a lawyer and the law stands. My mother's an attorney, and she said, if it's a bad law, change it.
Yes.
And I think that's what, women have been trying to do for so long, and also with the civil rights movement. But in terms of the poll tax, what we're finding is that courts are becoming more and more accepting of the equivalent of a poll tax. So requiring an ID, for instance, requiring a driver's license is the equivalent of a poll tax, because you don't get a driver's license for free. A driver's license or a state ID, you have to go to a government agency, you have to wait in line, you have to pass a battery of tests, and you have to pay a fee for it. And you have to take time out from your day, right, and travel to wherever this place may be. So many states have enacted the ID laws. So that is a return of the poll tax. It used to be, we remember you get mailed a voter registration card and it's free. And those are superfluous now. Nobody ever asks to see your voter registration card. They want an ID. There's also that's tied to this fake notion of voter fraud. So this is used as an excuse to impose new restrictions on voting. And we're seeing that in shocking new ways. Mary McLeod Bethune argued that one of the most important things that an African American could do was to pay their poll tax. And I think that it's fair to say in the 21st century, one of the most important things that citizens can do is to vote.
I have another question from the chat, and as if Black women were excluded from the amendments involving women to vote, do you believe white women would have gained the right to vote faster?
That's a really good question. What I have seen looking at the Florida papers, and I want to thank the Florida Federation of Women's Clubs, it's actually really hard to research suffrage. I was surprised. We're looking at documents from over a century ago. And there's been a lot of attention to suffrage. You would think it would be easy and there would be a lot of material digitized or in libraries, but it's actually quite challenging to find information. And the Florida Federation of Women's Clubs headquarters in Lakeland allowed me to visit right before the holidays. And I spent all this time taking images of their documents. It was really helpful. But the women from the Florida Federation, the leaders and members wrote the legislature frequently and wrote Florida's 2 U.S. senators and even censured them for their lack of progressive vision for not supporting women's suffrage. So part of it was tied to this, effort to make sure that Black women could not vote. But also there was a general reluctance to the idea of any women voting, particularly Black women, but also white women. So, for instance, the view was, and this is in these primary sources, right? You see it in newspaper accounts from the time, you see it in the women's clubs, minutes. Male politicians in Florida, many of them shared the view that it was a man's divine right to be the head of the household and to vote. Others expressed the view that voting was not a natural right. And when more progressive white male politicians in the Florida legislature argued that there's the precedent of Wyoming, where in 1869 they extended the suffrage to women, white men such as Chris Matheson, who was the longest serving mayor of Gainesville and then served in the Florida House of Representatives, said the laws of the West are no better than ours. So there was a general reluctance as well to the idea of women voting. And this was in Florida, and it was across the nation.
I want to encourage people before we wrap up and move on to closing to continue to ask questions if you have them. I want to talk about the interesting dynamic of what you said about women doing the work to support offices and doing the work anyway to make sure, and I'm reminded of articles and research I've done too, where so many women were doing the work to support male counterparts to get them elected for these different spots. When you look at women who were elected during this time period, this brief period for municipalities, do you think they were impactful? Do you think they were just there, or do you think they actually were treated as somewhat equal?
I think that they had both, right? I think that they did make an impact, but also that there were many who would discount them. So there's the expression that's popular now: if you're not offered a seat to the table, bring a folding chair. But at the same time, if you think of that image of the World Anti-Slavery Convention from 1840 and the women couldn't be seated, they're still standing. They were there in the gallery. So they couldn't be part of the formal decision-making process, but they were there. And I think, you could compare that to what women who were elected to the office in the 20th century were doing. They would have been excluded from, a lot of where the action was going on golf courses, in saloons, behind the scenes in men's lounges. But they would have nonetheless been able to make a difference. So what Mayman Jennings could do without being able to vote and without being elected to office was incredibly influential. So she worked in a variety of organizations and founded several organizations. And again, through the Florida Federation of Women's Clubs, was able to influence the political process while still being excluded from it.
Yes. I can't thank you enough for all the research and everything you've done. I want to say to the group, we will have the full presentation available for everyone. If we're not going to have any other questions, I did want to ask one more question about when you were talking about Reconstruction. During this time period of Reconstruction, you see tremendous growth in a lot of different areas, particularly for African Americans, even though it's a brief window. What do we see for women during this time period, which is often not discussed because of this?
Oh, that's such a good question. Reconstruction was a promise, right? It was a promise that was made to African Americans, and not just to Black men. The 14th Amendment grants citizenship to all born in the United States. When that was ratified, there were white and Black women who attempted to vote. In fact, much earlier, decades before the 19th Amendment, the state of New Jersey briefly offered, around the time of the American Revolution, offered women the right to vote, but then they took it back after about 20 years. So beginning back to Reconstruction, you for the first time had an African-American U.S. senator, you had Black congressmen, they were all men, but there were battles over how the 14th Amendment should be applied to also Black women and white women, and that is part of why the 15th Amendment clarified that the suffrage was intended for Black men, because it was a dialogue, right? The amendments themselves are unusual. The 15th Amendment is actually a negative statement. It says that the right to vote cannot be abridged on account of race or previous condition of servitude, but that opened up a Pandora's box of new ways that states could discriminate against Black men, including the poll tax, the literacy test, the grandfather clause. So it's this dialect of opportunity and constraint. You have 2 steps forward and 10 steps back. And we see that throughout American history. I think it's something important to understand. We're not moving in a constant line going forward, offering more equality and freedom. And I think we can really see that in the moment where we are today.
Thank you so much. This has been a really great and engaging, enriching conversation. And I just want to thank you. I also want to take time to thank you for having this class receive credit. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, at Stetson University, to graduate, each student is required to get what's called cultural credit, a certain number of cultural credits. And in the old days, pre-COVID, we had a lot of live programs and speakers who would come from around the nation. Now we're more limited. So virtual programs like this one are perfect, and it has been approved for cultural credit. So once this link is up, I'll share it, but we'll have the full series on the suffrage centennial that will be available for cultural credit. And it's a nice way for students, like offering pizza. This is more intellectual than offering pizza. You get cultural credit for attending. And in my own classes, African American history and introduction to public history, I am also offering extra credit if the students talk about, they send me a brief discussion saying what they learned, how they view the suffrage movement differently as a result of this discussion series. So thank you so much for organizing it.
Well, it's a great way for us to connect with the Florida college system. We're just so honored to work with you at Stetson, and then of course with our other 2 schools, University of Florida and Florida A&M, and we're excited about that. So Dr. Macdonald, I'm going to wrap. I want to say thank you again for your time and your talent, and I appreciate it. So at the Institute, we are wedded to not just working locally, but across the state and regionally, which is why we wanted to offer this series. We wanted to make sure that we took time to let people understand that we're just not focused on the smaller micro issues. We're wanting to engage in these conversations across our state, and suffrage was a great way to start. We hope you join us for our next series. The next series is with Dr. Ashley Robinson Preston, and she's with the University of Florida, and she's going to talk about pre-1920 issues. She is a well-known scholar regarding Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune, and so we're really excited to have her. We've all been engaged in many conversations leading up to this, so I know that you're in for an amazing educational, uplifting experience. And then followed by that, in our next series after that, we will have Dr. Kimberly Brown, and she is of Florida A&M University, and she's going to talk about the efforts of voting post-1920. So before I go, I want to say, why does it matter? All this matters because understanding history is an important part of how we engage with each other. Having these discussions in a civil manner is important to understanding why we make the decisions we make. And our ideology, regardless of what it is, it's important for us to understand how we engage with each other. The Institute, thanks to Congressman Bill Young, is dedicated to those issues. For more information, I'd really like you to go to our website, which we're excited about because we just launched it again. It's isps.spcollege.edu. Thank you so much for your time and your attention today. If you want to learn a little bit more about what ISPS does and how we engage the community, please take a look. With that, we'll close, and I'll say thank you again for all the hard work you did, Dr. Macdonald.